In chapter 2, the main premise or idea behind it is looking at human interaction with death. And it was something that we had talked over a lot because humanly, in general, we either see death as something we inflict, like war or murder or acts of aggression, or it's something you avoid at all costs. Vitamins and the next health fad or diet or exercise, anything. You're trying to prolong things, you're trying to extend and avoid pain, or live forever ultimately. But it's not something that people still will directly look at. And so when we were sorting through all of the archives, it was an image that really caught us because it's very contemplative. It's a gentle embrace. It's a face-to-face look at a very non-modern take on the Grim Reaper. And that was something that, I don't remember at what point we found it, but it was something that you were like, that eye to eye, they almost look like they're getting ready to hug. It's not at all Grim Reaper coming from behind or catching you off guard. There's an awareness, and in that awareness, there's like a peacefulness about it and its acceptance. And so when we were thinking about how that literally is what Memento Mori is, it was a piece that we wanted to find a way to weave into the narrative.
Yeah, and that's what's most important about chapter 2's image, like the main image that's on the back, is the presence of both beings. It's like you were saying, it's peaceful, and there's an embrace going on. You can interpret the painting in multiple ways by the way that, one, they're looking at each other and their eye contact, but also the way that their hands and their arms are on each other. It looks like she's almost I think they're both technically female figures or feminine figures, and one of them's got her hands, the human has her hands on the arms, but then the Grim Reaper is kind of like holding them. So it's like they're
grasping.
Yeah, and there's no
stealing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
like there's
just a
no
restful
pulling.
embrace.
Yeah, there's no pulling, there's no pushing away, there's no running away, there's no, like, they're both looking at each other and they're just kind of resting there.
There's no sense of avoiding.
Yeah, and I think that's why we gravitated toward it so much, and why, for me, as I was looking at it as more of a fan of a piece of artwork, I was like, this is just the imagery and the emotion that you can pull from it is like, I'm not heavy, I'm not depressed, I don't have a sense of distress. It's just like, I'm just looking at this and I almost feel like I'm invited into whatever emotion that they're dealing with. I don't know, it's very profound the way that we saw it, and I'm like, it fits this narrative and it fits this concept very well.
Right. And that was something overwhelmingly we had said we really wanted to bring about, because so many times anything associated with, well, especially Grim Reaper, but with death has such a abrupt and aggressive or invasive kind of, it just happens. And this is none of those things. It's almost pastoral when you look at it.
The more that we explored Memento Mori and death in itself as a concept, the more we realized and looked at it from multiple angles. And one of the things that we looked at was how death has the ability to bring people together. Whether that's bringing people together to mourn or celebrate a life, it still has the ability to bring people near and afar together in a relational context. And whether that's physically together or emotionally together, it still has that ability to do that. And that's what a lot of these pieces show, especially chapter 2, was bringing two beings that are moving together both in an intimate way, an emotional way, and in a relational, physical way, is just showing that death has the ability to take people and push them together. And that's kind of another way that we use to illustrate you have to deal with death, whether you like it or not. And it pushes you towards people, or it pushes you towards the reality of death. And it pushes you towards that in a way that you can either respond to it and work through it, or you end up running away from it. But the idea of it is you have the opportunity in front of you to reconcile those emotions. Exactly.
Right.
So that's, again, a lot of what these concepts and these concept pieces illustrate?
The final element that's incorporated in the back of the painting is a sketch, actually, and that's of two laurel wreaths, and they crisscross at the bottom. And as we had been looking at different symbols or elements that represented death throughout history, laurel wreaths is something that has been around since like the reign of the Romans. It's been around for a long time. And so that was something that you see a lot of times on old gravestones, just throughout many different commentaries to that end. But when we were then looking for the pocket designs, we had found this really great painting of these two women mourning at a gravesite, and they each have laurel wreaths in their hands. And so it was like a cohesive tie-in that represents the mourning and the loss that does come. Like death isn't always gentle, and it's not something you always welcome. It doesn't have to be something you fear, but it doesn't take away the heaviness of loss. And so you do have that represented on the front, along with a lot of other common death elements.
Right, and I even remember I found this graphic that was like a bunch of graphics smashed together, and it ended up being like this long Photoshop document piece, and it just had all of these like really simple icons that were depicting death. And so we looked through that so many times, referencing all of the pieces and all of the different cultural ways that people illustrate or even just pick elements from the natural world or the earth and say, you know what, this is what's representative of death. So I mean, obviously you got skulls, you had the sickle and the things with the Grim Reaper, but then you also had different flowers. So the laurel wreath was one of those, and we were like, let's add this as another element as that represents death, or that people use to show someone has passed away, or mourning, exactly, grief. And so when we found that in this painting that showed two women embracing, again, we were like, okay, there's two women embracing, they're grieving, while someone has separated from them into death and into the spiritual world, it's brought them together. And it's just like, this is a great picture. And they're also clutching circular laurel wreaths. And at the same time, putting a laurel wreath in a circular or an oval was representative of eternity. So it was like all this symbolism and just this really tiny piece that we put on the pocket just brought the whole piece together. And so putting the sketch on the back, having it on the front, brought the whole piece together into one uniform narrative again. And going through the other pieces, so another one of those sketch elements was the sketch element that's sitting on the other side or the other pocket was actually going to be its own piece. We messed around with that. I messed around with that for at least a month, trying to get it right to turn it into its own piece. And then I just gave it to you and I'm like, see if you can sketch this. See if you can turn it into its own sketch element that we can put on a pocket, because it's really representative of death and time, and we still wanted to show it. So I remember sending it over to Jo, and she just went to work on the sketch.
Yeah, and it was again something that was a continuous thought and just hadn't found the right expression of it. But with that, then it also needed to keep, something we kept coming back to was that we didn't want it to be like we're so fascinated with death that we're not valuing life. It's not an obsession with death that's dark per se, as more being just aware. And so time passing is a sense of awareness. The fact that the mourners are holding wreaths that are circular and continuous and looking at eternity is a perspective of life continuing after death in some capacity. And so it again was trying to balance that all out. And then one of the last pieces we added to that in the sketch was I had finished the hourglass, and you'd been like, hey, let's see if we can throw a skull in there. Just like to show like our time is passing, and then all you have left
eventually
bones. Yeah, it's just what's there.
Mm-hmm.
And just to keep that eternal perspective, that sense of not being afraid to look at it, but also that awareness of time being finite. And so that was really like the summation of everything that was being said in that.
Right. And from the narrative perspective, chapter 1 was the origin. Chapter 2 is really where we're at. It's the reality, and it's where we're at currently in the world. Is on the front you have two women embracing because of death, and that's very much representative of how we react when people pass away. And on the back, it's, dealing with death, embracing death. So chapter 2 is very much like in real time where we sit right now. Because then when we move into chapter 3, it goes into Jesus' death. So it kind of rotates and flips back and forth between origin, where we're at, where we're going, and then our response again. So it's very reminiscent of collection 1, the first collection, and kind of keeping that same origin, response, and interaction in all of it. So chapter 2 is very much the embracing of the reality of what happened in the origin in chapter 1.
Yeah. And it almost brings it back to the whole point we're trying to make in the short film that we had talked about at another time. But in putting yourself in that place, it's a place where you can reconcile and almost come to a place of maybe not peace, but acceptance with the fact that we are finite and this is where it's going, but it's not a place that has to be one of fear. And so in finalizing all of the thoughts and all of the elements that work together, it was like, yes, this is present, this is where we are currently at, and it's where we are hoping that we can get people to really think